Welcome to Week 2 of English 301, American Literature 1700 to 1820, Enlightenment and Revolution. The 18th century saw enormous changes, economic, social, philosophical, and scientific, that inevitably affected the influence and authority of clergymen, and transformed the ways in which they understood the world. Most important, many intellectuals now believed in the power of the human mind to comprehend the universe as never before. There would be a religious element to this new nation, but it would be only one component of a state whose destiny, while still thought of as divinely guaranteed, was understood to be achievable on earth through the spread of democratic principles. The literature of this century reflected and extended these and other new currents in Western thought and culture. The 18th century brought a new world into being in the most basic and striking ways. The increase in population alone helps account for the greater diversity of opinion in religious as well as in political life that marked it and its literature. The demand for and price of colonial goods increased in England, and vast fortunes were to be made in New England with any business connected with shipbuilding, especially timber, tar, and pitch. Virginia planters became rich through tobacco, and rice and indigo from the Carolinas were in constant demand. The rapid expansion of transatlantic trade, hallmark of what we now recognize as the beginning of modern consumerism, linked the colonies to other areas in what historians call the Atlantic Rim. Unified by the common experience of ocean passage and the desire to make new lives for themselves, these thousands of immigrants slowly but inexorably began to realize that they had more in common as inhabitants of America than they did as immigrants from a Europe that rapidly receded into memory. In 1702, no one would have dreamed of an independent union of colonies, but by the 1750s it was a distinct possibility. As you consider the impact of Enlightenment thought on American colonists as they transitioned to nationhood, try to appreciate Enlightenment rationalism as something more than just an attack on religion. While many Enlightenment thinkers were, indeed, outright atheists who would replace any sort of religious belief with a rational and scientific worldview, the majority were involved in a complex interplay between religion and science that served as a crucial underpinning of the intellectual climate of the American Revolution. To this end, it may be helpful to start by considering the popularity of deism, which entailed belief in both an all-powerful creator and the rational functioning of natural laws, among the founding fathers, and from there try to tease out the degree to which both religion and reason influenced life in the early republic. This self-portrait by American artist Charles Willson Peale serves as an excellent allegory for the ways in which Enlightenment thought inspired people to derive their knowledge of the world from direct observation. Witness the specimens of animals that Peale has included in his studio to use as a reference for his paintings. This illustration, from the work of Bernard Siegfried Albinus, a European anatomist, is another example of how Enlightenment thought encouraged people to learn firsthand how the world functions. Immanuel Kant famously answered the question, "What is enlightenment?" as, quote, "the courage to use your own reason." While scientific experiments such as that illustrated in this engraving, in which the human body is tested for electrical conductivity, may seem laughably naive, it is the 18th century's ambition and willingness to take risks in the pursuit of truth that should still inspire us today. At the same time that Enlightenment scientists and philosophers were engaged in a project to map out the workings of the natural world through scientific means, a transatlantic religious revival was taking place in the 1730s and beyond that saw preachers such as Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, who is pictured here in a painting by John Wollaston, attempting to recapture the spiritual fervor of the Puritan era. The awakening, in turn, engendered as many critics as supporters, for many believed that revivalists were too given over to enthusiasm at the expense of their reason. Thus, Edwards and others who believed in the new light that God had shed over them had to expend much of their time and energy in pamphlet wars with prominent clergy such as Boston's Charles Chauncey, who, from his pulpit in that city's first church, compared the fervor of the revivalists to the hysteria that Anne Hutchinson had engendered a century. During the famed Boston Tea Party of 1773, Colonists disguised themselves as Native Americans and dumped English tea into Boston Harbor to protest paying taxes on it and to test the limits of British rule. In adopting Native American dress, these protesters declared themselves antithetical to everything British. The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Drop, cartoon shows Lord North with the Boston Port Bill extending from a pocket, forcing tea, the intolerable axe, down the throat of a partially draped native female figure representing America, whose arms are restrained by Lord Mansfield, while Lord Sandwich, a notorious womanizer, restrains her feet and peeks up her skirt. Britannia, standing behind America, turns away and shields her face with her left hand. This late 18th century illustration of the injustices suffered by the American colonies at the hand of imperialist powers reflected the growing discontent among the colonists. It also illustrates how a burgeoning print culture in the Atlantic Rim allowed for the expression of such sentiments to reach a broad audience. The 18th century witnessed a revolution in print culture that would make authorship as we know it possible. This revolution in print would also have profound implications on the political events of the period. The first newspaper in the colonies appeared in 1704, and by the time of the Revolution, there were almost 50 papers and 40 magazines. The great cry was for a national literature, meaning anti-British, and the political events of the 1770s presented a dramatic opportunity for a career in letters. It is not surprising, then, that the most significant writings of the period are political. The Massachusetts Spy, pictured here, was one of 50 newspapers published in the colonies at the time of the Revolution. Such publications allowed not only for the dissemination of information at a theretofore unprecedented scale, but also for the consolidation of national identity as readers across the colonies began to feel a sense of common purpose. Notice the Join or Die logo at the top of the page. This widely circulated image became a means of defining what it meant to be an American at a time when most colonists felt a primary allegiance to their home colony. This is a cartoon published in the Pennsylvania Gazette by Benjamin Franklin, urging the American colonies to unite against the French and Indians. Variations of this motto were later used during the American Revolution. Many of you have probably seen this or a similar image before. What is the rhetorical impact of depicting the colonies as a unified organism? What made this such a compelling image for the colonists? Why do you think it circulated so widely? This is Thomas Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence. You may have studied the Declaration of Independence at great length. Some of you may even have memorized the preamble in high school. Whether you're unfamiliar with it or overly familiar with it, it's worth taking a moment to read through the preamble and to consider the radical new model for human governance that the document proposes, and the language in which it is expressed. As both a political document and a literary text, the Declaration is an essential touchstone of early American literature. This is an illustration of New Americans celebrating the ratification of the United States Constitution in New York City. The ship Hamilton passing the fort at Bowling Green, where members of the Congress greeted the procession. Just as the Declaration of Independence serves as a point of reference for the political and literary discourses of early America, so too did the Constitution provide both direct and indirect influence on some of the more important texts of the period. The Federalist Papers were written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison between 1787 and 1788 in support of a new federal constitution. Around the same time, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography and Hector St. John de Crevecoeur's Letters from an American Farmer were published, making the beginning of a new sense of national identity as colonists from greatly different backgrounds and of varied nationalities now found reasons to call themselves Americans. This is an illustration of the city of Philadelphia as it appeared in 1800. Newly independent of Great Britain, cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston became centers of intellectual life in the new republic, places for authors like Charles Brockden Brown and Washington Irving to establish their careers as American writers. Despite the promises made in the Declaration of Independence that the United States would safeguard the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of its inhabitants, the persistence of slavery in the new republic, along with the continued oppression of Native Americans and limited opportunities presented to women of every race, called into question the sincerity of that promise. This is a diagram of the interior of a slave ship known as Vigilante. Great Britain would not end its involvement in the transatlantic slave trade until 1807. The United States would soon follow suit in 1808, although the end of the slave trade did not mean the end of slavery. That would not come until 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. This is an illustration of an auctioneer as he begins the bidding at a slave auction in Richmond, Virginia. An estimated 645,000 Africans were brought to North America as slaves between the 17th and 19th centuries. By 1860, the U.S. Census listed over 4 million African American slaves. Slaves, and often the abolitionists who aided them, took matters into their own hands and pursued liberty by running away. A series of fugitive slave laws, the most important of which took effect in 1793, and 1850, were designed to prevent runaways from seeking freedom. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is considered by many scholars to be a major cause of the Civil War. Because the act required Northerners to return runaway slaves to their masters in the South, it effectively turned slavery into a national and not a regional law. Feeling that their state's rights had been violated, many Northerners who had previously been content to turn a blind eye to slavery now became committed to ending the institution once and for all. Women had far fewer rights than men in the early republic. They could not vote, and they were wards of their fathers until marriage, upon which their legal identity was merged with their husbands, so that they could not own property or keep for themselves any wages that they might earn. As the image on this slide demonstrates, women were relegated to a limited sphere of influence, keep within the compass, and were expected to remain there throughout their lives without opposition. This completes this week's video lecture. If you have any questions about its contents and/or the corresponding assigned readings, please contact your instructor and/or visit Norton's Study Space site by clicking this link.